For much of its nearly 200-year history, the square has been the center of Fayetteville life. A lot of history has occurred here, both good and bad. Before beginning our tour, it seems only fitting to remember who was here first, and to remember those lost in time who did the actual work of building the town that became the one we know today. The first people we know of in our area were the bluff and river dwellers of long ago. By the time the Anglo-European settlers arrived in the early decades of the 19th century, and before the early Cherokee, known as the Old Settlers, had moved nearby, this was the hunting land of the Osage people. Our town and county was also built upon enslaved labor, people working their entire lives with little or no recompense nor hope of freedom. There have also been countless laborers, farmers, and others who toiled in anonymity and without recognition. Washington County came into existence in the fall of 1828. In this town, the county seat was known as Washington Courthouse. Because there was another Washington down in Hempstead County in March 1829, the name was changed to Fayetteville because two county commissioners, James Buchanan and John Woody, had come here from Fayetteville, Tennessee, the seat of Lincoln County there. There had been 4 courthouses on the square. The first was built in 1829. What happened to it is unknown. The second was built in 1837, and it was brick, but it was apparently destroyed by fire. The third courthouse was built by George Baker in 1854. It burned in 1862 during the Civil War. After the war, Alexander Hendry built Washington County's 4th courthouse in 1868. This brick structure, as shown here, was demolished in 1905. After the last courthouse was torn down in 1905, for a while the center of the square was a nice little park with a gazebo in it. About 1909, work began on a big new post office in the middle of the square. It opened in 1911 and served local residents until 1963. In the 1970s, local citizens saved the old post office from being torn down and got it put on the National Register of Historic Places. It still stands in the center of the square today. This artist's rendering of a 1938 photo of the 4 sides of the Fayetteville Square is courtesy of the Washington County Historical Society. With some renovations and different businesses, the square looked much like this prior to the urban renewal phase that ran from the mid to late 1960s to 1979. The photo has been reordered to match the tour sequence that follows. The tour proper begins on the west side of the square, following the pattern in the Square Book by local historian Anthony J. Wapple with J.B. Hogan. The west side is the most intact part of the old square, and most of it will be covered, but not every building on this side or around the square will be discussed. The current Bank of Fayetteville building, with its Queen Anne-style corner tower, has anchored the north end of the west side for well over a century. The original occupant was W.T. Farrar and Company, a hardware store, but from 1912 to 1986, it was Lewis Brothers Hardware. The Bank of Fayetteville has been here since 1987. Just south of the Bank of Fayetteville is the Mrs. Young building. Mrs. Sarah Jessie Young was the wife of traveling dentist H.R. Young. They were in Fayetteville by 1877 with young son Charlie, who was born that year. About 1880, Dr. Young abandoned Mrs. Young and child, and she officially divorced him in 1883. The following year, 1884, she purchased the property of her building, and in 1887, her building was constructed on the west side of the square. For about 10 years then, Ms. Young was a successful photographer here. She specialized in family and individual portraits, and some of those photographs still exist in local collections. By 1901, she had retired and spent time with family in Kansas City, Los Angeles, and other places. In 1907, she sold her building, and although she seems to have dropped out of the public record after that, her building still stands as a testimony to her skill and perseverance. The old Campbell Bell building, dating to 1894, was home to the Campbell Bell department store from 1905 to 1984. Two incidents connected to this area of the square bear telling. The first occurrence was on Sunday, January 13, 1839. The John Binge contingent of the Cherokee Trail of Tears passed directly through Fayetteville. The travelers camped in the area just below Fayetteville High School on Martin Luther King Boulevard and further out near Martin Luther King Boulevard and Razorback Road. Some of the nearby Cherokee came uptown looking for a drink, and grocer Willis Wallace opened his store. After a lot of drinking, Cherokee Nelson Orr attacked a man who had insulted a Cherokee woman. Willis Wallace's little brother Riley intervened, and Willis Wallace then stabbed Orr in defense of Riley. There was a nearly violent confrontation with the Cherokee, but a Captain William Moody calmed the people. The Cherokee group left for Indian Territory the next day, but Nelson Orr suffered for several days before dying. In May of 1839, Willis Wallace was tried and acquitted. Not long after, he shot and killed another man and nearly stabbed another to death. Once again, he was acquitted of a justifiable homicide. After a standoff with A.W. Arrington and others who wanted to see him convicted, Willis Wallace left for Van Buren and then on to Texas. A year or so later, brother Riley Wallace killed the man previously stabbed by Willis. Riley reportedly moved on to Waco, Texas after this incident. Some 2 years after the Trail of Tears killing in 1841, an incident involving Alfred Wallace, Willis and Riley's brother, created an international incident. Nelson Hackett was an enslaved man whose escape to Canada and subsequent extradition set off the dispute. He was a personal servant to Alfred Wallace, owner of property and a store on the west side of the square. Hackett fled Fayetteville in July 1841, leaving with a horse, saddle, and other valuables. He traveled across Missouri and through several free states before going into Canada in late August. Alfred Wallace had Hackett tracked, arrested, and extradited for stealing the horse and other goods. The Canadian colonial governor's decision to extradite Hackett back to Arkansas made Hackett the first fugitive Canada had returned to slavery. In early summer 1842, a shackled Hackett arrived back in Fayetteville. He was publicly whipped before being sold to Texas slavers. He escaped again, and his ultimate fate remains unknown. Abolitionists used Hackett's case to secure a commitment from the British government that from then on made the extradition of those fleeing slavery nearly impossible. The city of Fayetteville is working on a plaque that will be placed near the north end of the old Camel Bell building to honor Nelson Hackett. For more information, see University of Arkansas history professor Mike Pierce's webpage, The Nelson Hackett Project. Another significant event connected to the west side of the square was the February 1912 X-ray strike. The X-ray strike stemmed from a group of students called the Iconoclasts, there were 36 of them, who published an underground newspaper called the X-ray that was very critical of the University of Arkansas and its faculty. The Iconoclasts were expelled by President John Tillman, and that resulted in large student protests both on campus and in town. After Arkansas Governor George Washington Donahue stepped in, the students were reinstated, and the University of Arkansas seemed to make an attempt to improve relations with them. Tillman resigned at the end of the semester and went on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. The picture here is by renowned photographer Birch Graybill, taken from his second-floor studio on the north side of the square. In the early 1950s, the building now occupied by riffraff was an unmarked 5 and 10 cent store, but by the mid-1950s, Sam Walton had opened his first Fayetteville store at this location. As mentioned, this building with a huge black wooden facade is currently occupied by the riffraff store, which has been there since 2012. Back in the day, the last building at the south end of the west side was the Live and Let Live drugstore, owned and operated by A.C. McAdams. Mr. McAdams hired a young man named Fred Schuler and later had Schuler run a second store down Dixon Street near the depot area, thus giving that area the name Schulertown. During the mid-1950s, the Oklahoma Tire and Supply Company, Otasco, was located here. This photo from around 1900 shows the west side of the square from a southern perspective. On our immediate left is Mr. McAdams' drugstore. Please note that at the far end of the block, the current Bank of Fayetteville has yet to be constructed. The current building at the south end is the only new one on the west side, built in 1979. It has housed Kleinen's Fayetteville Drug and Collier's Drug. Since 2010, it has been home to the Fayetteville Visitor Center. This remarkable photograph from 1874 shows the south side of the square on the left. At the mid-top, you can see the City Hotel, or the Glass Hotel it was also known as, that will be destroyed in 6 years. In the distance, you can see the gap leading over to the Indian Territory, or what is now Highway 62. From the 1870s until the 1960s, the southwest corner of the square was home to the City, Glass, and Washington hotels. In 1880, a tornado ripped through the City Hotel, killing Mrs. Glass and destroying property. Part of the Baum Brothers sign on the east side of the square ended up out in Goshen, about 10 miles away. The Washington Hotel, shown here about 1905, was here for about 50 years. From 61 to 1978, Woolsworth was located here. Currently, it is a church. The building on the west end of the south side of the square today houses the West Mountain Brewery, but long ago the Woods Opera House was on the second floor, the first known place that a movie was shown in Fayetteville in 1898. Later it was the Bud Brothers store, and from 1937 to 1977 it was J.C. Penney's, with a loud entertaining system of pulleys and small baskets used for sales and receipts. Next door was the Royal Theater, the cheap theater in town, showing serials and westerns starring Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, Whip Wilson, and the like. Tim's Pizza is there today. Notice the windows in both buildings are basically the same as they always have been. A portion of the south side was raised to create the opening leading to the town center in 2001 and the Peace Ball in 2002. Although there have been precious few black-owned businesses on the square over time, long ago, from 1880 to 1883, one of the now removed buildings was home to Nathan Dixon's Buckhorn Restaurant. When Mr. Dixon's business ended, he was quoted as saying, "His friends and family ate him out of house and home." Perhaps Fayetteville's richest man ever, Stephen K. Stone, had this building constructed, and over the years a number of businesses have been here, including an IGA grocery store in the 1950s, whose manager, Hubert A.G., was known as IGAG. The Gem and Java Coffee House is scheduled to move into this building in the near future. In 1900, this building on the southeast corner of the square was home to the Crenshaw Tin and Hardware store. Geisinger Music was here from 1924 to 1981. They were first on the west side of the square, then briefly on the east side, before moving into this building that they occupied for so long. Recently, it was the home to the Odom Law Firm, and today is the headquarters of the Fayetteville Roots Festival. All remnants of the original east side, as shown here, are totally gone. It was completely razed during urban renewal, which, as mentioned before, ran from about the mid to late 1960s until 1979. In some old photographs, however, like this one, we can identify some of the old buildings and businesses that used to be on the east side. On the right in this picture, you can see Dr. Paddock's building. It was next to Mountain Street on the south end of the east side. You may have heard or read this building referred to as Paddock's Corner. On the left is the first Baum Brothers store, with the Cravens building and the little bakery in between. A note here, this is shortly after the Civil War, and you can see what our town looked like in recovery after it had been burned to the ground. From 1919 to 1925, the Victory Theater, see the marquee with the light bulbs hanging down, occupied a ground floor portion of the old Baum Brothers store. E.B. Harrison's store was the lighter color building immediately to the left. The Palace Theater, shown here in 1942, was originally owned by movie entrepreneur W.F. Sonneman. At one time, he owned all 4 theaters in town: the Royal, Palace, Ozark, and UARK. The Palace was here from 1926 until 1974, showing films. It lasted a few more years as a music venue, including frequent shows by popular country duo Sarge and Shirley West. Next to the palace was Walton's second store on the square. It had been Scott's Five and Dime, and then Ben Franklin's, and then Walton's. Then came the Fayetteville drugstore, first owned and operated by A.C. McAdams, and then run by the Kleinens family for decades. On the north end of the east side for many years, especially during the 1950s, was Hunt's department store. They provided athletic clothes for school kids throughout Fayetteville. You can see the old Darling store on the left. In 1981, the current building replaced the entire block and was originally home to the First National Bank and then Bank of America. Today, its primary occupant is the University of Arkansas Pryor Center. The northeast corner of the square is the current site of the University of Arkansas Continuing Education Building. But way back in the day, it was first settler William McGar's grocery. Groceries were where whiskey was sold back then. As we saw a little before, in the 1950s, the Darling store was on this corner. In July 1881, right at the intersection of East Center and Northeast, right there by the Continuing Education Building, Marshal Will Patton and his deputy John Mountain were gunned down by unknown assailants. No one was ever charged for the murders. In this view of the north side of the square from 1938, you can get a pretty good idea of what the buildings look like on that side of the square all the way up through the late 50s and a little bit into the early 1960s. The first building on the right is the McElroy Building, originally a store run by William McElroy's son-in-law, early Fayetteville historian James H. Van Hoos. The Boston store occupied this space for many years. Next door is the Red Cross Drug Store. This was Mel Collier's first drugstore in town. Then comes the McElroy Bank itself, founded by William McElroy, and on the north side for over 100 years. The next building is Silverman's Jewelry Store. Prior to Silverman's Jewelry, it was Duke's Jewelry Store for many years. To the left, you can also see the Woolworth Building, and at the far left, you can see the First National Bank Building. This photograph from 1963 shows the expanded Boston store on your right, the expanded McElroy Bank in the center, and Price Patton on the left, just before where the Woolworth Building would be. Here's a recent photo of the north side showing the RVS Bank Plaza in the foreground. And here's a closer view of the RVS Plaza. This recent view of the western part of the north side shows a castle-like building that is about where the old Woolworths used to be. The adjacent building, recently renovated, was the Peacock and Pendleton Drug Store back in the day. It was then later the Whitlow and Lake Drug Store. The west end of the north side was called Blackwell Corner because the brothers A.J. and S.J. Blackwell had a building here, but in 1898, the current and also recently renovated First National Bank building was constructed at this location. Here's a photograph of the original old First National Bank building. And next is a photograph of the First National Bank recently renovated. The building on the northwest corner was originally the Lafayette Gregg building and became an early Bank of Fayetteville, no connection to the one today. Then it became known as the Easton Building, as most old-time Fayetteville residents call it. It dates from 1889 and was renovated in 1990-1991. Our tour ends with what might be called a pocket of history on the square and includes the Mrs. Young, Bank of Fayetteville, Easton, and First National Bank buildings. For more details on the square and several of the streets immediately leading off of it, see The Square Book by Anthony J. Wapple with J.B. Hogan.